The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, polished to such perfection they reflected the ornate ceiling like still water. Champagne flutes clinked in a symphony of wealth and celebration. Camera flashes exploded like tiny supernovas around Leonardo Bianchi, the man every culinary magazine called a genius, the chef with 3 Michelin stars who turned simple ingredients into edible art that made grown critics weep. But tonight, standing in the center of his own restaurant, surrounded by celebrities, billionaires, and food critics praising his latest creation, Leonardo felt nothing. He watched a Hollywood actress, someone whose face graced movie posters worldwide, take a delicate bite of his signature dish, seared foie gras with 24-karat gold leaf and white truffle reduction, plated on handcrafted porcelain that cost more than most people's cars. She closed her eyes in manufactured ecstasy, the kind of performance that made great television. The entire table applauded. Cameras captured the moment for Instagram, for magazines, for the endless content machine that fed on moments exactly like this. Leonardo smiled the smile he'd perfected over 1,000 identical events. Warm but not too warm, confident but humble enough to seem authentic. The smile of a man who had conquered his world, but inside, empty, hollow, mechanical. A robot going through programmed motions. He moved from table to table, accepting compliments with practiced grace. The umami balance is transcendent, chef. You've outdone yourself again, Leonardo. Absolutely revolutionary. The words washed over him like water over stone, touching him but leaving no mark, creating no impression. Later, alone in his penthouse overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, he stood before floor-to-ceiling windows and stared at his reflection. A 42-year-old man at the absolute peak of his profession. His restaurant had waiting lists that stretched months into the future. His cookbook had been on bestseller lists for 3 years straight. Celebrity chefs called him for advice. Culinary schools used his techniques in their curricula. He had everything a chef could dream of achieving. So why did he feel like he was drowning? Leonardo poured himself a glass of wine, a Chateau Margaux 1995 that cost $3,000 a bottle, and couldn't even taste it. When had food stopped meaning anything to him? When had cooking transformed from passionate creation into calculated performance? He tried to remember the last time he'd tasted something that actually moved him, that created an emotional response beyond clinical appreciation for technique and flavor profiles. He couldn't recall a single moment. That realization kept him awake until dawn, staring at the city lights, wondering if this was all there was. Success without satisfaction, achievement without joy. A life that looked perfect from the outside but felt like a beautifully decorated prison. The next morning, Leonardo made a decision that would change everything. He gathered his entire staff in the restaurant's main dining room, a space that usually hosted only the most elite clientele, where reservations required connections and deep pockets. Sous chefs, line cooks, pastry artists, prep workers, even the dishwashers and cleaning crew. Everyone stood waiting, confused by the sudden mandatory meeting. The room buzzed with nervous energy and whispered speculation. What was happening? Were there layoffs coming? Had something gone wrong with a health inspection? Had a critic written a devastating review? Leonardo stood before them at the head of the room, hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully controlled, but somehow vulnerable in a way none of them had ever seen. He looked at each face, people he worked with daily but barely knew as individuals. When had he stopped seeing them as human beings and started seeing them merely as functions, as tools to execute his vision? Then he spoke words that would shatter their reality. "I'm thinking about stepping away," he said quietly, his voice carrying perfectly in the silent room. "From the restaurant, from this life, from everything I've built here." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. His head sous chef, Marcus, a talented culinary artist who'd worked under Leonardo for 8 years, leaned forward, eyes wide with shock. The pastry chef, Diane, exchanged panicked glances with the sommelier. Every ambitious cook in that room suddenly saw their carefully planned future evaporating like steam from a hot pan. "But before I do," Leonardo continued, his voice stronger now, "I want to see who has the right heart to take my place. Who truly understands what this restaurant should represent?" The confusion deepened. What did he mean by right heart? This was haute cuisine, not a charity kitchen. This was about precision, technique, artistry. What did heart have to do with it? "I'm giving you 3 days, Leonardo, and I want each of you to create something that represents what this restaurant means to you. Not what you think will impress me, not what you think critics will praise. What it actually means to you deep down. The winner," he paused for emphasis, becomes my official successor. This restaurant, my reputation, my legacy, everything I've built over 20 years, it all becomes yours. The promise detonated like a bomb in the center of the room. This wasn't just a promotion. This wasn't a raise or a better title. This was a kingdom being handed over. A 3 Michelin star restaurant worth tens of millions of dollars. A name that opened any door in the culinary world. A reputation that could launch 1,000 opportunities. As Leonardo dismissed them, the kitchen exploded into barely controlled chaos. Chefs immediately began sketching ideas on notepads, arguing over which ingredients to claim, forming secret alliances and strategy sessions. The competition had begun before most of them had even left the dining room. Marcus immediately claimed the kitchen's entire supply of matsutake mushrooms, rare Japanese fungi worth their weight in gold. Diane called her supplier to order special chocolate from Madagascar and vanilla from Tahiti. Thomas, a senior line cook known for his aggressive ambition, secured all the A5 Wagyu beef and began planning a dish that would require 48 hours of preparation. The sous chefs started hoarding ingredients like dragons guarding treasure. The prep kitchen became a battlefield of culinary egos, each chef determined to create something so extraordinary, so technically perfect, so absolutely stunning, that Leonardo would have no choice but to name them as his heir. But in the back corner of the kitchen, almost invisible among the chaos and ambition, a young woman with flour-dusted apron and tired eyes simply nodded to herself, lost in thought. Clara Martinez, 26 years old, intern. 8 months into an unpaid position that mostly involved washing dishes, prepping vegetables, and staying out of everyone's way. She was so quiet, so unassuming, that half the staff didn't even know her name. To them, she was just the intern, or sometimes the girl, if they bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. While others rushed to claim the rarest, most expensive ingredients, white truffles worth hundreds of dollars per ounce, caviar that cost more than her monthly rent, exotic spices imported from remote corners of the world, Clara gathered something completely different. Simple vegetables from the produce delivery, day-old bread that would otherwise be thrown away, basic pasta, canned tomatoes, olive oil, garlic. Things so ordinary that the other chefs wouldn't even glance at them, let alone fight over them. "What are you planning to make with that?" sneered Thomas, watching her pack these humble ingredients into a worn canvas bag. His voice dripped with contempt. "Peasant food? You think you can win with spaghetti and day-old bread? This is a 3 Michelin star restaurant, not a soup kitchen." Other chefs laughed. A few made jokes about intern delusions and knowing your place. Clara just smiled softly, a smile that held secrets Thomas and the others couldn't begin to imagine, and said nothing at all. He'd learned long ago that some people would never understand, and explaining to them was a waste of breath better spent actually doing the work. Over the next 48 hours, the kitchen transformed into something between a war zone and a mad scientist's laboratory. Marcus deconstructed classic French bouillabaisse into an avant-garde presentation involving edible flowers frozen in liquid nitrogen, each element plated separately on custom-designed ceramics, the broth presented as a flavor cloud that guests would inhale before tasting the seafood. Diane constructed an architectural marvel in chocolate, a scale replica of the Eiffel Tower standing 2 feet tall, each beam hollow and filled with champagne ganache infused with actual Dom Perignon. The engineering alone required mathematical calculations and structural support wires so thin they were invisible to the naked eye. Thomas prepared Kobe beef aged for 90 days, served with a sauce that began as a 30-pound veal stock, reduced over 2 days until only 8 ounces of intensely concentrated liquid remained. The plating involved tweezers, pipettes, and a level of precision that would make a surgeon jealous. Everyone was creating their masterpiece, their magnum opus, their bid for culinary immortality. The kitchen staff barely slept. Some didn't go home at all, catching brief naps in the break room between stages of their elaborate preparations. The air thrummed with ambition, competition, and barely suppressed panic. Everyone was so focused on outdoing each other, on creating the most impressive, most technically challenging, most Instagram-worthy dish possible, that nobody noticed when Clara slipped out the back door at sunset on the second day. Nobody, except Leonardo. He'd been observing from his office, watching through the window that overlooked the kitchen. He'd seen the frenzy, the competition, the way his staff had transformed into gladiators fighting for a throne. It was everything he'd expected. Brilliant technique, creative innovation, culinary artistry at its peak. But something about Clara's quiet departure nagged at him. While everyone else performed their ambition like a theatrical production, she'd simply left, with a bag of groceries that any of them could have grabbed from any corner store. Where was she going? What was she planning? Curiosity, or perhaps instinct, that inner voice that had guided him through his career, made him follow her. He grabbed his coat, told his assistant he was stepping out for air, and slipped out the same back door Clara had used minutes before. He kept his distance, trailing her through Manhattan's streets as afternoon faded into the golden hour. He walked with purpose, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, seemingly unaware of the world-famous chef following half a block behind. Leonardo expected her to head toward her apartment in Queens. He remembered the address from her employment file. But instead, he walked in the opposite direction, away from the wealthy neighborhood where his restaurant stood like a temple to culinary excellence, deeper into parts of the city he rarely visited, parts where the buildings were older, more worn, where graffiti-covered walls and chain-link fences protected empty lots, where homeless people huddled in doorways against the evening chill. This was the New York that tourists didn't see, that most wealthy Manhattanites pretended didn't exist. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes of walking, Clara stopped at a community center, a squat brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since. The windows were clean, but old. The door was painted a cheerful yellow that couldn't quite hide the underlying decay. A hand-painted sign read, "St. Mary's Community Kitchen, all welcome, no questions asked." Leonardo watched from across the street as Clara entered, greeted warmly by a few volunteers, an elderly black woman who hugged her, a young man with tattoos covering his arms who took her bag with a grateful smile, a middle-aged woman who looked like she might cry with relief at Clara's arrival. They knew her. This wasn't her first time here, maybe not even her 100th. Leonardo moved closer, curiosity overwhelming caution. He peered through a window smudged with city grime. What he saw stopped him cold, rooting him to the sidewalk like he'd been struck by lightning. Clara had transformed the community center's small, outdated kitchen into something magical. The kitchen itself was nothing special. Old appliances that belonged in a museum, mismatched pots and pans, a cutting board scarred with decades of knife marks, a stove with burners that probably didn't heat evenly. But what she was creating there, she wasn't competing for glory. She wasn't trying to impress critics or win awards or secure her future. She was simply feeding people, real people, people who needed it. The community center's main room held maybe 50 people, homeless families with children whose clothes were clean but worn thin, elderly folks, some veterans, some simply people whose social security checks didn't stretch far enough, young people, teenagers maybe, who looked like they were living on the streets, working poor whose jobs didn't pay enough to cover both rent and food, immigrants who didn't yet have stable footing in this expensive city, human beings who were hungry, that's all, just hungry. Clara stirred a massive pot of minestrone soup made from those simple vegetables, carrots, celery, onions, tomatoes, zucchini, cannellini beans. Nothing exotic, nothing expensive, but the way she moved, the care she took, the attention she paid to seasoning and tasting and adjusting, she treated that soup with the same respect Leonardo's chefs showed their luxury ingredients. He sliced that day-old bread and transformed it into something beautiful, toasting it with butter, garlic, and herbs, until the entire room smelled like heaven. He boiled that basic pasta and tossed it with olive oil, fresh tomatoes, torn basil, a sprinkle of parmesan. Simple, honest, real. Nothing fancy, nothing Instagram-worthy, no gold leaf or caviar or liquid nitrogen, just good, nourishing food made with care. But the way people ate it, oh, the way they ate it. Leonardo watched a little girl, maybe 6 years old, close her eyes after her first spoonful of soup, a smile spreading across her face like sunshine. He saw an old man's hands tremble with gratitude as he held his bowl, tears running down weathered cheeks. He saw a teenage boy trying to act tough, but unable to hide his relief at having a warm meal. He saw a young mother feeding her toddler, whispering something that made the child giggle. He saw something he hadn't seen in his own restaurant in years, maybe ever. People experiencing food not as art or entertainment or status, but as fundamental human connection, as love made tangible, as proof that someone cared whether they lived or died. Clara moved through the room, checking on everyone, making sure each person had enough, bringing seconds to anyone who wanted them, chatting briefly with regulars, welcoming newcomers. She knew names. She remembered details from previous visits. He treated every person with dignity and respect, never a hint of pity or condescension, and Leonardo felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been locked tight for years, maybe decades. This was what he'd forgotten. This was what cooking was supposed to be. Not impressing people, not winning awards, not creating content for social media or building a brand or maintaining a reputation. Feeding people, nourishing bodies and souls, making someone's difficult day a little bit better. Showing fellow humans that they mattered, that someone cared, that they weren't alone in this harsh world. He stood there for nearly 2 hours, just watching through that smudged window, as Clara and her volunteer crew served meal after meal, cleaned up, prepared tomorrow's supplies, and finally locked up for the night. When Clara finally emerged, tired but somehow glowing with satisfaction, wiping her hands on her apron, she nearly jumped out of her skin when she saw Leonardo Bianchi, the chef, Leonardo Bianchi, standing there on the sidewalk like an apparition. "Chef Bianchi," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I can explain. I know I took ingredients from the restaurant, and I should have asked permission, but—" "Show me," Leonardo interrupted, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Clara blinked. "What? Tomorrow night. Show me how you do this. Teach me." "But the competition, your successor, don't you need to—" "I need to understand this," Leonardo said, gesturing toward the community center. "I need to learn whatever it is you know that I've forgotten." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for mockery or hidden agendas. But all she saw was raw honesty, vulnerability she wouldn't have thought possible from the intimidating celebrity chef she'd watched from afar for 8 months. "Okay," she finally said. "Tomorrow, 6 p.m. Bring comfortable shoes and prepare to actually work." Over the next 2 days, something extraordinary happened. Something that would have made headlines if anyone in the culinary world had witnessed it. Leonardo Bianchi, the man who commanded 50 chefs in his restaurant kitchen, who had cooked for presidents and royalty, who had appeared on magazine covers and television shows worldwide. That man stood beside a 26-year-old intern in a run-down community kitchen, learning to cook all over again, and he was terrible at it. The industrial stove heated unevenly, which threw off all his carefully calibrated timing. The pots were old and scratched, their surfaces not quite non-stick anymore. The knives were dull and handled poorly. The cutting boards wobbled. The measuring cups were missing. The oven temperature was anyone's guess. Leonardo burned marinara sauce. He overcooked pasta until it was mushy. He misseasoned soup and had to start over. His fancy knife skills meant nothing when working with a blade that could barely cut through a tomato. He nearly set a dish towel on fire. He dropped a tray of garlic bread, and Clara laughed, actually laughed, as she rescued his disasters and gently corrected his mistakes. "For someone with 3 Michelin stars, you're pretty terrible at basic cooking," she teased, stirring the pot he'd nearly ruined while he stood there looking sheepish. "I'm out of practice," Leonardo admitted, and the understatement was so absurd they both burst out laughing. It felt good to laugh. Leonardo couldn't remember the last time he'd genuinely laughed in a kitchen. His restaurant was always so serious, so precise, so focused on perfection, that humor felt like failure, like lack of discipline. But here, making mistakes was just part of the process. Burning something wasn't a catastrophe. It was an opportunity to try again, to learn, to improve. The stakes were somehow both higher. These people were actually hungry. And lower, nobody was rating them, reviewing them, judging them against impossible standards. They talked while they cooked. Clara told him about growing up in a large Mexican-American family in Los Angeles, where every gathering meant massive pots of pozole and tamales, made by committee, where food was the language of love, because often there wasn't enough money for other gifts. Where her grandmother could make magic from scraps, could transform a chicken carcass and some wilted vegetables into soup that tasted like home. "My abuela always said that the most important ingredient was knowing who you're feeding," Clara said, chopping onions with practiced efficiency despite the dull knife. "She said you can't cook well if you don't care about the people eating your food. That cooking without love is just chemistry." Leonardo told her about his own journey, growing up in Florence, learning to cook in his mother's trattoria, the simple pasta dishes and seasonal vegetables that had first sparked his passion. Then culinary school in Paris, apprenticeships in Michelin-starred restaurants, the brutal kitchens where chefs screamed and threw pans and treated food as warfare. "I learned technique," he said slowly, "but somewhere along the way, I forgot why technique matters. It became the end instead of the means. I started cooking to impress other chefs, to win awards, to prove I was the best. When did I stop cooking for the people actually eating the food?" When it stopped being about them and started being about you, Clara said simply, without judgment, just stating an obvious truth. The words hit Leonardo like a physical blow, but they were true, undeniably, painfully true. As they served dinner to the line of people waiting, each face telling a story of hardship and resilience, Leonardo experienced something he hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. Purpose. A young mother with a baby thanked him with tears in her eyes because his simple pasta meant she could save her limited food stamps for formula. An elderly veteran shook his hand and said the minestrone reminded him of his late wife's cooking. A teenage girl told him this meal would be her only food until the school lunch program started again on Monday. These people didn't care about his Michelin stars or his celebrity or his technical expertise. They just cared that someone had shown up, had cared enough to make them a warm meal, had treated them like human beings who mattered. "Why do you do this?" Leonardo asked Clara as they cleaned up after service, washing dishes in a sink with temperamental water pressure. "You could be back at the restaurant, working on your competition dish, fighting for everything I'm offering. Instead, you're here, using my ingredients to feed people who can't pay, who can't help your career, who can't give you anything in return." Clara paused, her hands in soapy water, considering her answer carefully. "Because this is what cooking is supposed to be, chef. It's not about awards or recognition or building a brand. It's about this." She gestured toward the now empty room where, hours earlier, dozens of people had sat eating, talking, laughing, simply being human together. "It's about making someone's day a little bit better, about showing people they're not invisible, about remembering that we're all human, and feeding each other is one of the most basic, most important ways we show that we care." She turned to face him fully. "Your restaurant is beautiful. The food is incredible. The technique is flawless. But who does it serve? Who does it actually help? Rich people who can afford $300 tasting menus don't need help. They're not hungry. They're not struggling. They're just entertained." "And these people?" Leonardo asked quietly. "These people are hungry," Clara said simply, "and I can help with that. So I do. It's not complicated." Leonardo felt tears prick his eyes, actual tears, which hadn't happened in, he couldn't remember how long. When was the last time he'd cried? When was the last time he'd felt something deeply enough to produce tears? He looked around the humble community kitchen with its scarred counters and mismatched equipment and walls that needed painting. Then he thought about his pristine restaurant with its marble and crystal and custom everything. Which space had more soul? Which had more purpose? Which actually mattered? He already knew the answer. On the third and final day of the competition, Leonardo returned to his restaurant. Contrast was jarring, from the humble community kitchen to this temple of culinary excellence, from feeding hungry people to impressing wealthy ones. The competition reached its climax. One by one, each chef presented their masterpiece to Leonardo and a panel of guest judges, renowned food critics, fellow celebrity chefs, the restaurant's major investors. Marcus's deconstructed bouillabaisse was a technical marvel, each element prepared with molecular gastronomy techniques that would have been impossible a decade ago. The presentation was stunning, like edible art arranged on the plate with mathematical precision. Diane's chocolate Eiffel Tower sculpture was breathtaking, a feat of engineering as much as pastry work. When she demonstrated breaking it open to reveal the champagne ganache inside, the judges actually applauded. Thomas's Kobe beef was perfection, cooked precisely to medium rare throughout, the fat rendering at just the right temperature, the sauce providing umami depth that lingered on the palate. The plating was elegant and sophisticated. Every single dish was exceptional. Flawless technique, stunning presentation, complex flavors balanced with precision. These were dishes that could win awards, earn stars, make magazine covers. Leonardo tasted each one, made notes, asked technical questions. He nodded approvingly, smiled at the appropriate moments, gave compliments where they were earned. But the entire time, his mind was at St. Mary's community kitchen, watching a little girl smile over a bowl of simple soup. After the last presentation, Leonardo stood before his assembled staff. The tension in the room was electric. Every chef waited to hear their fate, to learn who would inherit this kingdom. "I want to start by saying that every dish presented today demonstrated exceptional skill," Leonardo began. "The technique, the creativity, the execution, all of it was outstanding." The chefs relaxed slightly, pleased with the praise. "Marcus, your molecular approach to classic French cuisine shows innovation that could reshape how we think about traditional dishes. Diane, your pastry work rivals the best I've seen anywhere in the world. Thomas, that beef was perfection." He paused, and the room held its breath. Because of this exceptional work, I'm pleased to announce that Marcus and Diane will both receive significant promotions. Marcus, you'll become executive sous chef with a substantial raise and equity stake in the restaurant. Diane, you'll oversee our new pastry research and development program with the resources to explore any creative direction you choose. The room erupted in congratulations, applause, relief. These were life-changing promotions for both chefs, but Leonardo wasn't finished. However, he said, and the room quieted again, neither of you will be my successor. Confused silence. What did that mean? If not Marcus or Diane, then who? Thomas looked hopeful for a moment, but Leonardo's gaze passed over him without stopping. Instead, Leonardo's eyes drifted toward the back of the room, where Clara stood in her stained apron, not having presented anything at all, looking uncomfortable with the attention of so many ambitious chefs focused on her. Several people noticed the direction of his gaze. Whispers started. "What about her?" Thomas finally called out, his voice sharp with contempt and poorly concealed jealousy. "The intern who disappeared during the competition. Who stole ingredients for her little charity project? Is she your chosen one?" The word charity was spoken like an insult. Several chefs laughed. Leonardo opened his mouth to respond, to defend Clara, to explain what he'd witnessed and learned. The words were there, ready, burning to be said. But then his phone buzzed. A text from one of the restaurant's major investors, who was also one of the guest judges. "Careful, the board is watching. Can't afford controversy." And Leonardo hesitated. Just for a moment, just a few seconds of silence where he weighed his options. Defend this intern who'd shown him truth, or protect the reputation and business he'd spent 2 decades building. That moment stretched too long. The silence became uncomfortable, awkward. Clara saw it, that flash of calculation in his eyes, that brief internal debate about whether she was worth the risk. And something in her expression closed off, shut down like a door slamming shut. "I think we're done here," Leonardo finally said, his voice hollow even to his own ears. "Thank you all for your exceptional work. We'll make final decisions about the succession plan in the coming weeks." It was a coward's answer, politician's non-answer, a way to avoid commitment while he figured out how to navigate the complicated politics. Clara didn't wait to hear more. She untied her apron, hung it on its hook with careful precision, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Leonardo watched her go and felt something die inside his chest. That hesitation, those few seconds of silence, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Within hours, the rumors began spreading like wildfire through the culinary world's gossip networks. Thomas and 2 other chefs, terrified that Leonardo might actually choose an intern over established professionals, had prepared their insurance policy. They'd spent the past 2 days creating a narrative, planting seeds with carefully chosen bloggers and food journalists. That night, the stories dropped. Scandal at Bianchi's. Intern accused of stealing premium ingredients. Chef Bianchi's protégé involved in charity fraud investigation. Sources say rising star used restaurant resources for personal gain. The articles were cleverly written, full of alleged and sources claim, but designed to destroy without technically committing libel. Photos of Clara at the community kitchen, taken by someone who'd been following her, were presented as evidence of her stealing expensive ingredients for unauthorized purposes. Anonymous quotes from concerned staff members painted her as manipulative, as someone who'd seduced the famous chef to gain favor, as an opportunist using vulnerable people as props for her own advancement. The stories hit food blogs first, then Twitter, then mainstream media picked them up. By morning, Clara's face was being discussed on culinary forums and social media worldwide. The restaurant's investors panicked. The board called emergency meetings. Lawyers advised caution. PR firms suggested distance. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was this intern a liability? Should they sever ties immediately? And Leonardo, caught between protecting his reputation and defending the woman who'd reminded him of his humanity, made the worst mistake of his life. He stayed silent. Not a defense, not a denial, not even a no comment. Just silence. Radio silence. His publicist issued a bland statement about reviewing the situation internally that satisfied no one and helped no one. Clara heard about his non-response from a news alert on her phone. He was at St. Mary's community kitchen, preparing for the evening service when the notification popped up. Leonardo Bianchi refuses to comment on intern scandal. She read the article with hands that didn't shake. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The article quoted the restaurant's official statement, which was full of corporate non-speak, but essentially threw her under the bus while pretending not to. She read about how Leonardo had been blindsided by the allegations, how the restaurant took all claims of misconduct seriously, how they were conducting a thorough internal review, all code for, "We're cutting ties with this person to protect ourselves." The woman who'd shown him kindness, who'd taught him more in 3 days than he'd learned in 3 years, who'd reminded him why cooking mattered. He couldn't even speak up for her when it mattered most. Clara set down her phone, untied her apron with careful, controlled movements and walked out of the kitchen. She walked past volunteers calling her name, past people waiting to be served, past everything. She walked until she reached her tiny studio apartment in Queens, climbed the 4 flights of stairs, locked her door and finally, only then, in private where no one could see, let herself break down. When Leonardo tried to call her that evening, she didn't answer. When he texted, she didn't respond. When he showed up at her apartment building and buzzed her door, she looked at his name on the intercom screen and walked away from it. "Clara, please," his voice came through the speaker, crackling with desperation. "Let me explain. Let me make this right. I know I messed up, but please." She picked up the receiver, and for a moment Leonardo felt hope surge through him. "You already did explain, Chef." Her voice came back, hollow and distant and so utterly broken it made him physically hurt. "Your silence explained everything. It explained exactly where I rank in your priorities. It explained what I'm worth to you when your reputation is at stake." "That's not—" "Yes, it is," she interrupted, her voice firm now. "You know what the worst part is? It's not that you didn't defend me. It's that you hesitated. For just a few seconds back in that kitchen, I saw you calculating whether I was worth the trouble. And that calculation, that's what killed whatever I was starting to feel for you." The line went dead. Leonardo stood on that Queen Street corner until security asked him to leave, calling Clara's phone over and over until she blocked his number entirely. For the next week, Leonardo Bianchi existed in a fog of self-loathing and regret. He went through the motions, directing the kitchen, greeting VIPs, maintaining appearances for investors and board members who praised him for handling the situation professionally. Professional. That's what they called his betrayal. Professional. The restaurant ran smoothly, efficiently, perfectly. 3 Michelin stars continued to shine. Reservations remained impossible to get. Critics still called his food transcendent. Money kept flowing in. Everything was exactly as it had been. Except Leonardo finally understood with devastating clarity what he'd been trying to tell his staff at the competition. Technique without heart was meaningless. Success without purpose was just empty achievement. All the stars and awards and acclaim in the world meant nothing if you sacrificed your humanity to keep them. He'd found something real, someone real, and he'd destroyed it because he'd been too afraid, too proud, too invested in protecting an image he'd spent decades building. His gilded prison had become a grave. On the 8th day of this misery, Leonardo did what he should have done from the beginning. He investigated. It took 3 days of digging, reviewing security footage, interviewing suppliers, talking to staff members one-on-one, tracking down the sources of the leaked photos. He hired a private investigator. He called in favors from journalist friends. He pursued the truth with the same obsessive focus he usually reserved for perfecting recipes. Slowly, piece by piece, the real story emerged. Thomas had orchestrated the whole thing, motivated by pure jealousy and fear. He'd recruited 2 other chefs who were equally threatened by the possibility of an intern receiving what they felt was rightfully theirs. They'd created fake documentation, suggesting Clara had stolen more than she actually took. They'd doctored timestamps on security footage. They'd paid a struggling food blogger to write the initial hit piece, knowing other outlets would pick it up. They'd manufactured a scandal from nothing because they couldn't accept that someone with less formal training, fewer credentials, and humbler origins might actually understand something about cooking that they didn't. Leonardo assembled every piece of evidence methodically, security footage showing exactly what Clara had taken, much less than the rumors claimed. Receipts proving she'd actually been paying for ingredients herself, replacing what she borrowed. Testimony from community kitchen volunteers about her months of service. Financial records proving no fraud of any kind had occurred. Most damaging of all, text messages between Thomas and his conspirators, plotting the whole thing, laughing about how easily people would believe the worst about a nobody intern. Leonardo felt rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But beneath the rage was something more powerful, more consuming, shame. Not just shame at Thomas and the others for their cruelty, shame at himself for doubting Clara, even briefly, shame for his hesitation, shame for valuing his reputation more than doing what was right, shame for being exactly the kind of person who prioritized image over integrity. That shame burned like acid. eating away at everything he thought he knew about himself. The restaurant was hosting a charity gala that weekend, an annual event that drew celebrities, food critics, influential journalists, and every major player in the culinary world. It was the kind of event where reputations were made or destroyed, where a single moment could become the story everyone talked about for years. Leonardo decided it would be the perfect stage for truth. The gala sparkled with designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Champagne flowed from bottles that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The guest list read like a who's who of wealth and power: tech billionaires, Hollywood producers, fashion moguls, and the entire upper echelon of the culinary establishment. Cameras flashed constantly. Social media influencers live-streamed every moment. This was the kind of event where being seen mattered almost as much as the cause they were supposedly supporting. Leonardo moved through the crowd mechanically, shaking hands, accepting compliments, playing his role. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. What he was about to do would either redeem him or destroy everything he'd built. Maybe he deserved destruction. As the evening's program began, Leonardo stepped to the microphone. The crowd quieted, expecting the usual welcome speech. Instead, his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. His carefully prepared speech, vetted by lawyers, approved by PR people, sat folded in his pocket. He wasn't going to use it. "Good evening," he began. "Before we begin tonight's service, I have something important to say, something that can't wait any longer." The room's energy shifted. People sensed this wasn't going to be standard. Phones came out, cameras turned on. Journalists leaned forward. Leonardo took a deep breath and jumped off the cliff. "A week ago, I announced a competition to choose my successor. Many of you heard about the controversy that followed. Accusations against Clara Martinez, stories about theft, fraud, manipulation." He saw Thomas go pale in the back, trying to edge toward an exit. Leonardo's head of security moved to block the door. "I'm here tonight to tell you that every single one of those accusations was a lie," Leonardo continued, his voice growing stronger. "A deliberate, calculated, malicious lie spread by people who felt threatened by Clara's genuine talent and extraordinary character." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The murmur of shocked conversation began, but Leonardo pressed on. "I have proof. Hours of security footage, financial records, testimony from witnesses, even text messages between the conspirators, all of which I'm releasing to the press immediately after this event. The people responsible are being terminated effective immediately, and if Clara wishes, she has grounds for significant legal action." The murmur became a roar. Phones were out everywhere now. This was the scandal of the season, but Leonardo wasn't finished. "But more importantly than exposing those lies," he said, and now his voice cracked with genuine emotion, "I need to apologize, publicly, permanently, on record." The room fell silent again. This wasn't standard celebrity crisis management. This was something raw, something real. When Clara needed someone to believe in her, I hesitated. When she needed someone to defend her, I stayed silent. When she needed courage from me, I showed her cowardice. I allowed doubt to cloud my judgment. I prioritized protecting my reputation over protecting someone who had shown me more about the true meaning of cooking in 3 days than I'd understood in 20 years of chasing stars and acclaim. Leonardo looked directly at the nearest camera, knowing Clara might be watching. "Clara, if you're watching this, I need you to hear me say this. I'm sorry. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry. You deserved better. You deserved someone who would fight for you the way you fight for others every single day. You deserved someone with the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it costs something." His voice broke completely now, tears visible in his eyes on the massive screens around the room. "You showed me that I'd lost myself, that I'd built a beautiful prison of success and achievement, while forgetting what any of it was supposed to mean. You reminded me that cooking isn't about impressing people. It's about feeding them, nourishing them, showing them they matter. And when you needed that same care from me, I failed you completely." The room was absolutely silent now. Several people were crying, not just crying, but openly weeping at the raw honesty of what they were witnessing. This restaurant, these stars, all of it means nothing if it's not connected to something real, if it's not in service of something beyond my own ego and reputation. Clara understood that instinctively. She lived it every day. And I had to lose her to finally learn it. Leonardo stepped back from the microphone, no longer trusting his voice. The room remained frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then from somewhere in the back someone began to clap. Others joined. Within seconds the entire room was applauding. Not polite golf claps, but genuine, moved, emotional applause. But Leonardo didn't care about the applause. He only cared about one person's response, and she wasn't there. The next 3 days were the longest of Leonardo's life. The video went viral, tens of millions of views across every platform. The culinary world exploded with commentary. Some praised his courage, others called it a publicity stunt. Everyone had an opinion. Leonardo ignored all of it. He called Clara obsessively, though it went straight to voicemail. He went to her apartment. She wouldn't let him up. He went to St. Mary's. The volunteers wouldn't violate her privacy. He'd done the public part, the confession, the apology, the exposure of truth. But that was the easy part, in a way. Public gestures were theatrical, performative. What Clara needed was the private part, the part that couldn't be captured on camera, the part that required him to sit with his failure, to accept that he might have destroyed something irreparable. On the 4th day, a text came from an unknown number. St. Mary's tonight, 6 p.m. Don't be late. Leonardo's heart nearly exploded from his chest. He arrived at 5:30, pacing outside like a nervous teenager, rehearsing what he wanted to say. Clara showed up at exactly 6 p.m. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt instead of chef's whites. He'd never looked more beautiful to him. "You have 3 minutes," she said without preamble, arms crossed defensively. "Make them count." Leonardo had prepared a speech. He'd written it, revised it, memorized it. But faced with her, with the hurt in her eyes, the walls she'd built, the damage he'd caused, all those carefully chosen words evaporated. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just about staying silent, about everything, about what matters, about what success means, about what I was building my life around." Clara said nothing, just watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I built this entire life around impressing people," Leonardo continued, words tumbling out now, unpracticed and raw. "Around being the best, earning the most stars, getting the most recognition. I told myself it was about the craft, about excellence, about pushing culinary boundaries. But really, it was about my ego, about proving I was worth something, about building armor so thick that nothing could hurt me." He took a step closer. She didn't move away, but she didn't move toward him either. But that armor became a prison. "I was so protected, so insulated, so focused on maintaining this image that I'd lost touch with every real thing. I couldn't taste food anymore, couldn't feel joy, couldn't connect with anything genuine. I was successful and miserable and too proud to admit it. And then," Clara prompted, her voice carefully neutral. "And then you reminded me what cooking is supposed to be," Leonardo said, his voice breaking. "You showed me that feeding people isn't about technique or creativity or innovation. It's about love, about seeing other human beings and caring whether they're hungry, whether they're struggling, whether they're okay. You did in 3 days what 20 years of success couldn't do. You reminded me I'm human." Clara's expression softened slightly, but she still didn't speak. "And when you needed me to be human back to you," Leonardo continued, tears now flowing freely, "when you needed me to show the same courage and care you'd shown me, I failed. I hesitated. For just a few seconds, I calculated the cost to my reputation, and in those seconds I proved I hadn't learned anything at all." He wiped his eyes roughly. "I don't have any excuse. I can't claim I was confused or overwhelmed or that I meant well. I made a choice, a cowardly, selfish choice to protect myself instead of protecting you, and that choice revealed exactly who I'd become, someone who valued image over integrity." "Why should I believe you've changed?" Clara asked quietly. "Why should I believe this isn't just another performance, another calculated move to manage your reputation?" It was a fair question, maybe the fairest question anyone had ever asked him. "You shouldn't," Leonardo admitted. "Words are easy. Apologies are easy. Public confessions are easy, honestly. They're theater, and I'm good at theater. The hard part is actually changing, actually being different when it's difficult, and there's no one watching to applaud." He met her eyes directly. "So I'm not asking you to believe I've changed. I'm asking you to let me prove it. Not with words or gestures or grand romantic declarations. With actions, with consistency, with the day-to-day work of actually being the person I should have been all along." Clara was silent for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent, like she could see every thought, every doubt, every genuine emotion, and every remaining hint of self-interest. Finally, she spoke. "You know what, Chef?" she said, and the tiniest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. "If you ever test me like that again, if you ever choose your reputation over doing what's right, If you ever make me doubt whether I matter to you, I swear to God, I'll make you eat burnt ramen for the rest of your life." Leonardo laughed, really laughed, the sound surprised out of him by the absurdity and perfection of the threat. It was so perfectly Clara, mixing humor with dead seriousness, letting him know she was willing to try, but also establishing clear boundaries. "Deal," he said, still laughing through tears. "I accept those terms completely." They didn't kiss then. It wasn't a movie moment with swelling music and perfect lighting. Instead, they just stood there in the fading daylight outside St. Mary's community kitchen, two imperfect people deciding to try again, to see if something broken could be repaired. "So what now?" Clara finally asked. "Now," Leonardo said, "we start over. Really start over. Not with you as my intern or my employee or someone in my shadow. As equals. As partners. Partners in what?" "In building something that actually matters," Leonardo said, and for the first time in years, he felt certain about his direction. Something that feeds souls, not just egos, something real. Clara studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Let's see what you've got, chef." Over the next 3 months, Leonardo Bianchi did something that sent shockwaves through the culinary establishment, something that made business analysts question his sanity and other chefs whisper that he'd lost his mind. He transformed his 3 Michelin star restaurant into something the world had never seen. The changes started decisively. Leonardo fired Thomas and his co-conspirators publicly, with detailed explanations of their misconduct. He settled with them legally to avoid drawn-out litigation, but made it clear they'd been terminated for cause and would receive no recommendations. Then he made Clara an official partner. Not employee, not protégé, but equal partner with equity stake and decision-making power. The board of investors objected vehemently. Leonardo bought out anyone who wouldn't accept the change, even though it cost him personally millions of dollars. "This isn't negotiable," he told the remaining investors in a tense board meeting. "Clara stays as full partner, or I walk away from everything and start somewhere else. Choose." They chose to stay, barely, but they stayed. Then came the real revolution. Leonardo and Clara redesigned the restaurant's entire operational model. Every morning, from 6 a.m. to noon, the restaurant became a community kitchen. St. Mary's expanded operation. They served simple, nourishing food to anyone who needed it. Homeless families, struggling students, elderly people on fixed incomes, working poor whose paychecks didn't cover both rent and food, immigrants, veterans, anyone. No questions asked, no means testing, no judgment. Just, "Are you hungry?" and "What can we make for you?" The food was basic, but made with the same care and quality ingredients as the evening service. Fresh bread, hearty soups, simple pasta, seasonal vegetables, protein-rich beans, fortifying grains. Clara led this operation, training volunteers, managing the kitchen, greeting guests with warmth and dignity. Then from 6 p.m. to midnight, the restaurant operated as it always had. Haute cuisine, exceptional wine list, impeccable service, the full 3 Michelin star experience. But with one crucial difference: every single penny of profit from the evening service funded the morning operation and other food justice initiatives throughout New York City. They called it the Full Circle, a name Clara had suggested, representing the idea that food should nourish everyone, from the most vulnerable to the most privileged, and that serving one group could support serving the other. The culinary world was shocked, skeptical, critical. "He's destroying his brand," said one famous food critic. "This is financial suicide," declared a restaurant consultant. "Mixing charity with fine dining cheapens both," sniffed a rival Michelin-starred chef. "He's lost his mind," was the consensus among many of his former peers. But something unexpected happened. The evening reservations became even more impossible to get. Not despite the morning community kitchen, but because of it. People wanted to be part of something that mattered. Wealthy diners felt good knowing their expensive meal was feeding hungry families. Celebrities posted about it on social media. The restaurant's waiting list grew from months to over a year. More importantly, the culture inside the kitchen transformed completely. Chefs who'd once competed viciously now worked as a team. Morning volunteers included evening line cooks who discovered that feeding people who were genuinely hungry was more satisfying than impressing jaded critics. The rigid hierarchy that had defined high-end kitchens for centuries softened into something more collaborative, more human. Marcus, who'd been promoted to executive sous chef, told Leonardo one morning after they'd served breakfast to 200 people, "I've worked in Michelin kitchens for 15 years, chef. This is the first time I've actually understood why we do it." Leonardo and Clara fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the community kitchen, working side by side, laughing at each other's mistakes, celebrating small victories. Afternoons planning menus for both services, arguing passionately about ingredients and techniques, challenging each other to be better. Evenings in the fine dining service, executing flawlessly while staying grounded in purpose. And somewhere between the morning rush of feeding families and the evening choreography of fine dining, between debates over recipes and shared laughter over burnt toast, they fell completely, undeniably, in love. It wasn't dramatic. No single moment where everything clicked, just a gradual realization that they'd become essential to each other, not in a desperate, dependent way, but in the way that made everything better, richer, more meaningful. Clara challenged him constantly, never letting him slide back into ego or pretension. Leonardo supported her vision, using his resources and reputation to amplify her work. They balanced each other, her heart and his technique, her groundedness and his ambition, her humor and his intensity. They had their first real kiss 3 months in, after a particularly chaotic morning service where everything had gone wrong. The ovens malfunctioned, a food delivery was late, they ran out of bread halfway through. Yet Clara had managed to coordinate everything, keep everyone calm, and still ensure no one went away hungry. Leonardo, covered in flour and exhausted, and so full of admiration he thought he might burst, had pulled her into the walk-in cooler for a moment of quiet and said, "You're extraordinary, do you know that?" Clara, sweaty and tired and beautiful, had rolled her eyes. "I'm really not, I just—" He'd kissed her then, unable to wait another second, unable to pretend this wasn't exactly what he wanted. She'd kissed him back, her hands in his hair, both of them laughing against each other's mouths because kissing in a walk-in cooler, surrounded by vegetables, was absurd and perfect, and so perfectly them. "About time," Marcus had said when they emerged, making them both blush like teenagers. 6 months after Leonardo's charity gala confession, he decided it was time for something bigger, something that would solidify their vision and announce to the world what they were building. He planned a special event, part celebration, part statement, part unveiling of what the full circle truly meant. He invited everyone, the media that had once crucified Clara, the celebrities who'd always supported him, the investors who'd doubted the business model, the critics who'd questioned the concept. But most importantly, he invited every person who'd ever eaten at the morning community kitchen, every homeless family, every struggling student, every elderly person. Every one of the hundreds of people Clara had fed over the months. The restaurant's main dining room had never seen anything like it. Wealth and poverty sitting side by side at the same tables. A tech billionaire next to a homeless veteran. A famous actress sharing bread with a single mother. A James Beard award-winning chef chatting with a teenager who usually slept in subway stations. For this one night, everyone was equal. Everyone was simply human, gathered around food, which was how it should always be. The evening's centerpiece, the dish Leonardo had spent weeks perfecting, was presented to every guest simultaneously. It looked simple at first glance, a bowl of soup with a slice of rustic bread on the side. But as people tasted it, they realized the depth, the complexity, the layers of flavor that revealed themselves gradually. It was the same minestrone Clara had made that first night. Leonardo followed her to St. Mary's, the simple vegetable soup that had cracked open his heart. But now, elevated with technique he'd spent 2 decades mastering. The vegetables were perfectly brunoise. The broth had depth from hours of careful reduction. The herbs were balanced with precision. The bread was homemade from a sourdough starter Clara's grandmother had given her, baked in the restaurant's ovens until the crust was perfect. It was humble and sophisticated at once, simple and complex, accessible and refined. It represented everything they were trying to build. Food that respected tradition while embracing innovation, that nourished bodies while feeding souls, that didn't have to choose between excellence and accessibility. As the room filled with the sounds of people eating, talking, laughing, rich and poor sharing the same meal, the same space, the same moment of human connection, Leonardo stood to address them all. "Thank you for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying through the sound system. "This meal, this moment represents what this restaurant has become, what Clara has taught me it should always have been." He gestured to Clara, who sat at a center table, tears already streaming down her face because she knew what was coming. "This dish you're eating is the same soup Clara made the night I followed her to St. Mary's community kitchen 6 months ago. That night, I was lost. Successful but empty, accomplished but miserable. I'd spent 20 years building a reputation while losing my soul. The room was absolutely silent, every person listening. Clara reminded me that cooking isn't about impressing people. It's about feeding them, body and soul. It's about seeing another human being and caring whether they're hungry, whether they're struggling, whether they're okay. It's about using whatever skills and resources you have to make someone else's life a little bit better. Leonardo moved from his position at the front of the room to where Clara sat, unable to be that far from her, while saying what needed to be said. Clara Martinez, you saved me from a life that looked perfect but felt like a prison. You reminded me why I fell in love with cooking in the first place. Not for the awards or the recognition, but for those moments when food connects people, when it nourishes something deeper than hunger. He took her hand, feeling it tremble in his. And in the process of teaching me all that, of showing me what really matters, of challenging me to be better than I'd allowed myself to become, I fell in love with you, completely, irrevocably. The kind of love that changes everything. Clara was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. So I'm asking you now, in front of all these witnesses, people you've fed, people you've inspired, people whose lives you've touched, will you not just be my partner in this restaurant, but my partner in life? Will you marry me? Leonardo pulled out a ring, not something ostentatious or expensive, but a simple band with a small, clear stone. He'd chosen it carefully, knowing Clara would hate anything flashy or excessive. Clara looked at the ring, then at him, then at the room full of people, wealthy and poor, famous and unknown, all united in this moment, and she started laughing through her tears. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, you ridiculous, wonderful, infuriating man. Yes. The room erupted, not the polite applause of formal events, but genuine joy, cheering, crying, celebrating. People who'd never met before were hugging, sharing in the happiness of two people who'd found each other against all odds. Leonardo slipped the ring on Clara's finger and kissed her, both of them laughing and crying and completely, perfectly happy. When they finally pulled apart, Clara said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "But remember, burnt ramen for life if you ever choose your reputation over me again." Leonardo laughed. "I remember. I'll never forget." The celebration continued long into the night. Champagne flowed freely for everyone, regardless of whether they'd paid for their meal or received it for free. Marcus gave a toast about how Clara had taught them all what real cooking meant. Diane presented a wedding cake she'd made in secret, 5 tiers of perfection decorated with simple flowers, elegant and understated, so perfectly Clara. But the most powerful moment came near midnight, when an elderly homeless veteran who'd been eating at the morning kitchen since it opened stood up, his hand shaking as he raised his glass. "I don't know much about fancy cooking," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't know nothing about Michelin stars or whatever, but I know when someone sees you as a human being, when someone treats you with dignity, when someone cares." He looked directly at Clara. "Miss Clara, you did that for me, for all of us. Every morning you didn't just feed us food, you fed us hope. You reminded us we still mattered when the whole world treats us like we're invisible." His voice broke, and several people in the room were crying now. "And Chef Leonardo, you didn't just apologize for your mistake. You actually changed. You used everything you had, this fancy restaurant, all your talent, your reputation, to support her vision, to help people like us." He raised his glass higher. "So here's to both of you, to building something that actually matters, to remembering that we're all human and feeding each other in whatever way we can is the most important thing we can do." Everyone stood, raising their glasses, crystal champagne flutes and plastic cups alike. "To Clara and Leonardo," the room chorused, "to the full circle, to remembering what matters." Leonardo and Clara stood together, hands intertwined, looking around at this impossible, beautiful collision of worlds they'd helped create. This space where wealth and poverty, success and struggle, privilege and hardship all existed together without hierarchy, united by the simple act of sharing a meal. This was what they'd built. Not just a restaurant, but a revolution. Not just a business model, but a reminder of what it meant to be human. The following months were a whirlwind. Leonardo and Clara got married in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Community Kitchen, surrounded by volunteers, homeless families they'd served, and a few close friends. Clara wore a simple dress that cost less than 1 plate at the evening restaurant service. Leonardo wore a suit but no tie, his shirt collar open, looking more relaxed and genuinely happy than he'd ever looked in professional photographs. The wedding dinner was served family style. Huge platters of pasta, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, simple salad. Clara's grandmother's recipe for pozole. No gold leaf, no molecular gastronomy, no foams or emulsions or plates that required instruction manuals. Just good food made with love. shared among people who cared about each other. It was the best meal Leonardo had ever been part of. The full circle model proved not just sustainable, but profitable beyond anyone's expectations. The morning community kitchen continued to grow, eventually serving over 1,000 meals per week. The evening fine dining service had a waiting list over 2 years long, but more importantly, the concept spread. Other chefs began experimenting with similar models, using fine dining profits to fund community feeding programs, breaking down the barriers between haute cuisine and humanitarian work, remembering that food was meant to nourish everyone, not just entertain the wealthy. Leonardo and Clara became advocates for food justice, speaking at conferences, consulting with other restaurants, helping develop policy recommendations. But they never forgot where they started. Every morning, they were still in that community kitchen, cooking alongside volunteers, greeting guests, making sure everyone who showed up got fed. 1 year after their wedding, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. How would they balance a child with the demanding work they'd chosen? But as Clara's belly grew and they prepared for parenthood, they realized their child would grow up understanding something essential, that all people deserve dignity, that feeding others is sacred work, that success without purpose is empty, and that love, real love, means choosing each other over and over, even when it's hard, even when it costs something. Their daughter was born on a snowy February morning. They named her Sophia, after Clara's grandmother, who'd first taught her that cooking was love made tangible. 3 months later, on the restaurant's anniversary of the full circle model, they held another celebration. Sophia was there, sleeping in a carrier strapped to Clara's chest as Clara moved through the morning kitchen service, somehow managing to coordinate feeding 200 people while wearing a baby. Leonardo watched her, this extraordinary woman who'd saved him from himself, who'd taught him what actually mattered, who'd shown him that the most important ingredient in any recipe was caring about the people you were feeding. She looked up and caught him staring, gave him that smile that still made his heart skip beats. "What?" she mouthed across the busy kitchen. "I love you," he mouthed back. She rolled her eyes in mock exasperation, but her smile widened. "I know. Now get back to work, chef. These people are hungry." And so he did, because that's what it was all about, really. People were hungry. For food, for connection, for dignity, for love, for meaning, for purpose. And if you had the skills and resources to help feed that hunger, in whatever form it took, then doing so wasn't optional. It was fundamental to being human. Leonardo had spent 20 years forgetting that simple truth. It had taken losing everything, or almost everything, to remember it. But now, cooking beside his wife in a kitchen that served everyone equally, with their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, preparing food that would nourish both homeless families and celebrities, he finally understood what success actually meant. It wasn't stars or awards or acclaim. It wasn't wealth or fame or influence. It was this: the satisfaction of feeding someone who was hungry, the joy of work that mattered, the peace of living aligned with your values, the love of a partner who challenged you to be better, the hope represented by a child who would grow up knowing that every person deserves dignity. It was, finally, the true flavor of life, not the artificial taste of gold leaf and empty achievement, but the honest, nourishing, soul-feeding flavor of purpose and connection and love. Sometimes the greatest meals don't come from the rarest ingredients or the most complex techniques. Sometimes they come from remembering the simplest truth, that food is love, and everyone deserves to be fed, body and soul. Leonardo had been chasing perfection for 20 years. What he'd found instead, through Clara's simple act of feeding hungry people with humble ingredients, was something infinitely more valuable: meaning. And that, he finally understood, was the secret ingredient that had been missing from every dish he'd ever made. Not technique or creativity or innovation, though those all mattered, but purpose, care, the genuine desire to nourish rather than impress. That was what made food transcendent. That was what turned cooking from craft into calling. That was what transformed a meal from fuel into something sacred. As the morning service wrapped up, Leonardo stood in the doorway between two worlds. On one side, the community kitchen, humble, worn, real. On the other, the fine dining room, elegant, refined, aspirational. But they weren't separate anymore. They were one circle, feeding each other, supporting each other, reminding everyone involved that we're all human, all deserving, all worthy of nourishment in every sense. Clara came up beside him, Sophia asleep against her chest, and slipped her hand into his. "Ready for tonight's service?" she asked. Always, he said, as long as you're with me. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Always. And in that moment, standing between two worlds that were really one world, Leonardo Bianchi finally tasted what he'd been searching for his entire career. Home, purpose, love, truth, life. The flavor he'd been chasing for 20 years had been there all along, waiting in the simplest places, in humble ingredients treated with respect, in hungry people fed with dignity, in work that mattered, in love that challenged and supported and sustained. He just needed someone brave enough to show him where to look. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations come from the simplest truths. Real success isn't measured in stars or awards, but in lives touched and souls nourished. Feeding each other, in whatever way we can, is the most fundamental human act. Love means choosing someone over and over, even when it costs you something. We all deserve dignity, care, and a seat at the table. If this story moved you, remember, we all have something to offer, some way to nourish each other. The question isn't whether you have enough to make a difference, it's whether you're willing to share what you have. That's where everything begins. That's where transformation lives.